Welcome everyone to the Institute for Public Knowledge. My name is Eric Seidenberg. I am the director of the IPK, faculty member in sociology here at NYU. For those of you who are new to IPK, we are a university-wide institute that brings together people from all the different schools to take up matters of public concern. We do a lot of work on things like climate change and democracy and racial inequality and the future of work and technology. So it's a busy time here at IPK, and we're going to stay busy as long as we can. We're really happy to see so many faces here tonight. We have a lot of working groups that take on original research projects. We have a number of large public-focused projects, and we do a lot of book launches. Those of you who spend a lot of time in universities know that, generally speaking, we celebrate new books by our colleagues by putting them up on panels where we can ask them really tough and difficult questions. There's a seat right over here. We sometimes punish each other with our celebrations of books. We try to do it in the kinder, gentler style here. And tonight we're going to lean more into celebration than into the tough side. But as you'll see, we'll ask lots of good questions, and you will become part of the tough questioning process. We're really lucky tonight because we have one of my favorite NYU colleagues, Linda Gordon, one of the great American historians around, who's just published this book. I can literally say hot off the press, right? 7 Social Movements That Changed America. Linda is going to speak about her book for about 20 or 30 minutes. And then another one of the great American historians here at NYU, Steven Hahn, is going to come up and ask her some questions, make a few comments, and then we're just going to turn it over to you so you can ask questions. Those of you who are come to IPK know that we take pride in doing these great events and making them free and open to the public. Everything we do here is free unless you're a student, in which case we charge you $90,000. But what we do like to do is make sure that the bookseller who is here for public events doesn't have to carry lots of books home with her. So there are books for sale at the end of the talk. I know that Linda would be thrilled to sign books. Is that fair to say? Yes, she's thrilled. She's ready to sign books. So take a minute to get a book before you leave. I have a long page of formal bios, and I'm going to do my best to give you the short version of what I'm going to do. What you need to know is Linda Gordon is the Florence Kelley Professor of History and University Professor of Humanities here at NYU. She has won 2 Bancroft Prizes. This is a big book prize for U.S. historians, and is the author of acclaimed books, including The Second Coming of the KKK. She wrote a biography of photographer Dorothea Lange. Her first book, Women's Body, Women's Right, The History of Birth Control in America, remains the definitive history of birth control politics in the U.S. She's written a history of welfare called Pitied But Not Entitled. She also won the Berkshire Prize, and one of her Bancroft Prize winning books is The Great Arizona Orphan Abduction. An amazing record, and this new book will add to it. Steven Hahn is an acclaimed writer and also a professor of history here at NYU. His works include Illiberal America, a history, I think is the most recent book, right? A Nation Under Our Feet, which won not just the Bancroft Prize, but also the Pulitzer Prize for Good Measure, and A Nation Without Borders. It's an honor for me to work at an institution that has people like Linda and Steve on the faculty. I'm really excited about the conversation tonight, so please help me in welcoming, congratulating Linda.
I need this, yes? This book has 7 chapters, and 6 of them are about movements that I really admire, and I would suspect that you would too. One of them is not. It is about the Ku Klux Klan. It seemed to me very important to make it clear that not all social movements are admirable. I'm going to talk about that today, and then I'm going to talk about the progeny, the child of the Klan, which were the American fascist groups of the 1930s. This doing what I'm trying to do, it called to mind a particular quotation I really like. It was attributed to Mark Twain, some people say it wasn't really his, and that is, history does not repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. Since today's vocabulary, today's vocabulary includes the term populist, I start here. In the 1890s, American populism was mainly a progressive movement, speaking especially for small farmers, a population rapidly becoming disfranchised by corporate power, while some Southern populists were committed to racist politics. Most in the North were not. With workers as allies in some places, their program could be called social democratic. It included a progressive income tax, abolition of national bank, direct election of senators, an 8-hour working day, and government regulation of railroads, telegraph, and telephone services. The transition to a less constructive populism began with the massive Northern Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s. I think most Americans have heard something about the Klan, but this Klan is a very different animal from the one in the South. This was a mass movement with somewhere between 3 and 5 million members. It was treated as a respectable organization, and it was, in the main, nonviolent. It made Protestant nationalism its base theory, strategy, and key to its success. Positioning itself as a patriotic force, it condemned Catholics and Jews, who were at the time largely immigrants, condemned them as undesirable aliens. This right-wing populism evoked while also building what British culture critic Raymond Williams called a structure of feeling, pointing to the emotions that undergird and sustain ideology, especially when it becomes a mass ideology. In this vein, I'm inclined to think that this approach, the relationship of emotions to ideology, is a valuable approach to today's right-wing populism. The Northern Klan's populism grew not primarily from rural or small town populations, but to a large exception on urbanites. 50% of Klan's people lived in large cities, and 32% lived in somewhat large cities. Klan sympathizers feared something very fundamental to cities, diversity. It sought to restore American purity, which is defined as uniformity and considered by them absolutely essential to American patriotism. Like today's right populists, the Klan built its politics and its emotions through claims that the nation had been stolen from true Americans. Diversity in itself eroded patriotism, they argued. For example, new Klan members were inducted through a ritual known as naturalization. In other words, they become citizens of the Klan, and the outsiders were called aliens. This is something I will mention later, but just to give you a sense of the size. This is a big 1924 demonstration in Washington, D.C. The picture can't give you the sense of how many people are there. If you look very, very carefully, very faintly in the back, you see the Capitol, but this is a very long way that this march. Now, a brief summary of Klan arguments. Catholics are subverting the nation, first of all because they drink alcohol, as if Protestants didn't. That's another story. But mainly, they took orders from the Pope, and they could never become loyal citizens of the United States unless they converted to Protestants. Jews were ruthless and dishonest merchants. Their prosperity depended on cheating their customers, a position that ignored the great majority of American Jews who at that time were working class. In the Klan speak, Jews were biologically incapable of becoming loyal Americans. They could not be safe by converting. In fact, I can't not tell this story because I thought it was so delicious. Some Klan lecturers offered as proof of what the Jews were really like the story of Jonah and the whale. Jonah emerged whole from the fish, not a body in his bone broken, because he was indigestible. His Jewishness was too hard even for the powerful digestive machinery of the monster. The Klan's view of class was incoherent. Its propaganda praised what they called the middling people, but it had no objection to increasing radical economic inequality. The search for profit is a virtuous search. The rich deserved to be rich. We see this contradiction today in applying the term populist, which sort of doesn't describe anything like the 1890 populist. But the Klan's explosive growth was driven not by ideology, but by exploiting its members financially, and its recruitment was a state-of-the-art business arrangement. It hired a PR firm, and some historians say that this is probably the first time that a social movement hired a professional PR firm. They built their mass movement by profiteering. New members had to pay an initiation fee of $10, which was worth $160 in today's money. This is not a clan of poor people. But the recruiter of this $10, the recruiter could keep $4. The remaining $6 would be forwarded up through the hierarchy to the headquarters of the Klan. The genius, of course, of this arrangement is that every new member could use his membership to earn. Within 15 months, unsurprisingly, the Klan reported that it had taken in $1.5 million, which is in the billions today. I mention these practices not to elicit moralistic scorn, but because these business dealings are fundamental to what it stood for. They also got in money raising by selling trinkets of all sorts. Furthermore, traveling Klan lecturers charged admission fees. This was not unusual in the 1920s to pay to hear a lecture. Radio was not yet widespread. The best Klan lecturers delivered rousing performances. There were as many as 40,000 of these lecturers, again, because it was a money-making proposition. Some of its speakers, such as Amy Semple McPherson, I use that name because many of you have heard of her, were into creating these big tent Ku Klux Klan lectures. Like a political party, the Klan secured nominations for its friendly candidates, circulated slates of approved candidates, and lists of those it wanted to defeat. It brought supporters to the polls, it lobbied politicians in office, and scored a great deal of positive newspaper coverage. Nationally, the Klan elected 16 senators, scores of congressmen, and 11 governors, and these are only those who presented themselves proudly as Klan members. They ran mostly as Democrats, but occasionally as Republicans, progressives, even farmer labor supporters. Attitudes toward the Klan did not divide among party lines. No political party condemned the Klan. Supreme Court Justices Hugo Black and Edward Douglas White were members of the Klan, as was President Harding and President Truman, although he resigned after people explained to him that it would cost him the Catholic vote. No one has been able to count the thousands, probably tens of thousands of Klansmen elected to state and local offices. The Klan wielded decisive political influence in Indiana, Oklahoma, Oregon, Colorado, and Texas, and it won control of the city governments of Dallas, Fort Worth, and both Portland, Maine, and Oregon. Between 1922 and 1932, the majority of all elected officials in state officials in Oregon were Klansmen. Wielding this political power, the Klan chalked up two major victories in 1924. This is one of them. This is the Democratic Convention. Going into the convention, Al Smith, who was the governor of New York, was the leading candidate, but he was a Catholic. The Klan went all out to destroy the reputation of Al Smith and succeeded. A month later, the Klan led the way to the first major anti-immigration act of the United States. This act, to ensure that Nordics and Aryans would continue to dominate America, the act installed a quota system for immigrants. I'll just give you a few figures so you get that picture. 51,000 for Germany, 34,000 for Great Britain, 100 for Greece, and of course, 0 for Asians. In effect, this law was in effect until 1965, and it was one of the used to prevent admitting many Jewish refugees in the United States. The Klan shrank precipitously after 1925, but American fascists continued the cause with slightly different ideology and tactics. The ACLU has estimated that at least 100 such groups formed between 1933 and 1941, most of them initiated by former Klansmen. The fascists revised Klan ideology in three ways. They discarded anti-Catholicism to make anti-Semitism their sole cause. They rejected democracy, and they made violence their only strategy. First Spain, then Italy, then Germany were the models they wanted to follow. This marvelous sleight of hand allowed them to claim American patriotism while openly supporting and receiving aid from European fascists. The most popular fascist spokesman was the Catholic priest Charles Coffin. A national radio star, he was one of the most famous men in America in the 30s. His listenership reached tens of millions. Now we have radio, right? So he can really reach a lot of people. He claimed to receive 80,000 letters a week. On one occasion, he even said it was 1 million. I have no reason to believe it. His speeches were theatrical, hammering the pulpit, gesturing with a fist, sweat streaming down his face. He was kind of a shock jock without music. He organized what he called the Christian Front to support Franco against the anti-fascist Popular Front. Opposing Franklin Roosevelt's attempt to bring the U.S. into the World Court, Coughlin described the World Court as a Jewish plot, using this classic contradictory anti-Semitic tropes. Jews are international plutocrats, international bankers, even as he charged that they were all communists. This lack of consistency did not seem to weaken his support. He drew his facts about Jews directly from Nazi publications. They liked to refer to Roosevelt as Rosenberg, Rosenbaum, Rosenblum, etc. They, of course, were extremely hostile to Franklin Roosevelt.
His vast support worked to make fascist violence acceptable to many Americans. His Christian front soon began building militias, calling them platoons, drilling young men with guns. They were particularly violent in Boston, with some tacit support from the Catholic clergy, who of course would have been attacked the previous decade by the Klan. They beat and stabbed Jews on the streets. They ripped clothes off girls. Nat Hentoff, who grew up in a Boston Jewish neighborhood, remembered, and I'm quoting, "We felt hunted. None of us had the slightest doubt that pogroms could happen here too." The violence against Jews was common even in New York City with its very, very large Jewish population. Coughlin claimed that 6,000 New York City policemen were members. I think that was unlikely, but the police chief himself reported that about 1,000 of his cops were members. The smaller fascist groups were even more violent. One Klan leader, worried that his membership was declining, invented the Black Legion to revitalize his cause. He discarded the white robes in favor of more edgy costumes like this. At first, at this time, the color black symbolized fascism internationally. Black shirts, as they were called, were attacking unemployed demonstrators in London, marching in Kenya, patrolling the streets of Argentina. Soon, fascist uniforms appeared in many colors: gray in New York, Johannesburg and Cape Town, blue in China, green in Cuba, etc., etc. Whatever the color, these groups understood themselves as part of a rising global movement. To join the Black Legion, you had to swear to support lynch law, to procure guns, and to perjure yourself when necessary in order to protect the organization. Bloodthirsty oaths swore them to, and I quote, "work unceasingly toward the extermination of the Jewish people." By contrast, the creator of the Silver Legion, another of these fascist groups, was so weird that he might not have been welcome, certainly in the Klan. He claimed to have been a spiritualist, and he said that he had died, he had gone to heaven, where he remained for 7 minutes, during which the rise of the Fuhrer was prophesied, and he, a guy called Kelley, who was the head of the Silver Legion, he acquired the ability to unlock the hidden powers within himself. He was then sent, he claims, as a secret courier to Moscow, where he learned that it was the Jewish race that had created the Bolshevik Revolution, even having learned that Lenin was a half-Jew. Called by God to lead the fight against Jewish communism, he created his legion on the day Hitler came to power. He called himself the American Hitler. He invented a terrifying ritual because he wrote, as his expert social movement organizer, you have to have mystery in a fraternal organization to keep it alive. The folks eat it up. That's a quote. He designed dramatic militarist uniforms to attract recruits. In this case, a silver shirt, not a black shirt, riding breeches with leggings, and high black riding boots. Many of you will recognize that outfit as what the Germans were wearing. And mimicking the Klan's profiteering, he sold these outfits for $10. However delusional, the Silvers were not timid. Every red-blooded American citizen should have a good gun and ammunition. Speaker said in Portland, a stronghold of the fascists as it had been for the Klan. In 1934, they scheduled a coup against the Roosevelt administration for May 1st, because it was the labor and communist holiday.
Their stormtroopers, which is a direct translation from the German, would lead, local army units would join, and the Marines would train them. Put up a target and have your wife practice shooting if you want to keep a free government. Words like this clearly anticipate what we have heard from the NRA many decades later. They actually planned, they said, to release cyanide gas in synagogues during Hanukkah and Yom Kippur, and to inject typhoid germs into a dairy that served Jewish neighborhoods. None of this happened. But threats became not delusional when the men of these legions were hired by Ford and General Motors, just like the mining companies had hired Pinkertons in earlier decades, hired them to attack union organizing drives, the drives that would go on to create the UAW. The legions committed multiple murders, beatings, lynchings, and floggings. They bombed, set fires, released highly concentrated naphtha into a union office. The head of the Michigan State Police believed that at least 50 unexplained suicides were actually the Legion's work. In Minneapolis, where Ford had a plant, they joined the police in threatening and attacking striking Teamsters. Eric Selrod, the future CBS war correspondent and a university student in Minneapolis, witnessed some of this, writing, and I'm quoting from him, "Suddenly I understood deep in my bones what fascism was." I just want to show just a couple of images that had to do with probably the most famous strike of auto workers in the region, that actual sit-down strike where they actually occupied the factories. Here's one, Fisher Body shop, and they're really living there. They had an orchestra, they found out how to cook things and so on. This is just one of the many photographs of the pitched battles between police and often army people against union men who were trying to go in. These threats were not delusional. The Legion men were hired by Ford and General Motors. By contrast, the largest fascist group was the German American Bund. It maintained a benign public presence, even as it was financially supported big time by the Nazi Foreign Office. It illustrates some of the paradoxes of American fascism. It emphasized patriotism, but saw itself as transnational. One of the marches. And it took orders directly from the Third Reich. Seeking German approval, that they greeted each other with Heil Hitler, a large swastika atop their stages. Though it was not violent, it was different from the others in that sense, and it was a much, much larger movement that was a movement in which whole families were members and women played an important role. It conducted uniformed military drills in which men goosed out to carrying rifles. Boys wore uniforms and carried wooden replicas of rifles, practicing marching in perfect unison. Unlike the legions, the Bund was in part an ethnic fraternity, using German whenever possible. But their Germanness was also a political identity. Their view is you have to choose between the Soviet star and the swastika. Here there were many contradictions ideologically. One leader called the German folk, quote, an expression of the most sublime form of true democracy, while another declared that, and I quote, "We will not be fooled by your sugar-coated democracy." The Bund attempted to
attempted to reconcile this obvious contradiction by promoting George Washington as a hero, calling him the first fascist. He was a realist, he said, who knew that democracy could not work. One spokesman transformed the Klan slogan, which was, "If Jesus were alive today, he would be a Klansman," into, "If Washington were alive today, he would be a friend of Adolf Hitler." Unlike the other groups, the Bund created social movement-style activities for families. It purchased several campgrounds and staged events that resembled state fairs. Its Frauenschaft, the women's division, ran these doings featuring bands, singing, games, gymnastics, contests, and, of course, July 4th celebrations. And it ran children's camps, including one in the Catskills, which offered the children political education, including eugenics, taught them German, and published a kids' magazine in German. Also, like the Klan, the group financed these activities by charging dues, purchase of uniforms, and silly Nazi paraphernalia. I find myself wondering if the American fascist groups could have stabilized and grown their organization had they followed the strategy of the Bund rather than the strategy of the very violent legions. When I did this research, I never imagined that I would be comparing these movements to our contemporary situation. 60 years ago, but certainly well within my lifetime, some rather sectarian new leftists began to use the label fascist so widely that it became nothing more than a generic pejorative and lost its actual historical content. I think we need to look at fascism a bit historically, at least as a historical concept. I'm no expert on European fascism, but it seems to me that some of the patterns visible in the Trump-Musk administration could be said, to quote Twain, to rhyme with earlier fascism. I just want to make a short list of just some of what I see as the rhymes. Focusing on enemies within who are endangering the nation, extreme nationalism, lust for expansion, although Greenland is hardly a good candidate for Lebensraum, drive to control resources. For Trump, this is oil. For the Nazis, it's grain and oil. Insatiable need for adoration, demanding acquiescence from anyone who seemed like they might be a threat, cutting off access to journalists and other media people who showed independence, lightly coded encouragement of violence. You can think of the muted putsch and the attack on the Capitol, forcing sectors of big capital and institutions into deference. And finally, revenge, passionate commitment to punishing anyone who disagreed. The term fascism is hard to get rid of, in part because we lack another term for right-wing populism and its innovations. Democracy, the rule of law, well-being of the population, undermining universal suffrage, undermining free speech, undermining the right to protest, and the health and well-being of the majority of Americans. How do we name this? I don't know. Maybe it is a new form of fascism. If so, I think it's important that we need more particulars. We need the details. Otherwise, I worry that the term, once again, just becomes a generic pejorative. And I'd just like to quote, end with an astute comment from some decades ago by Toni Morrison. She wrote, "Before there was a final solution, there had to be a first solution, a second one, even a third. The move toward the final solution was not a jump. It is one step, then another, then another." That's it But it scared me.
I'm going to sit because the last person I would talk down to is
Either mic up.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me in the back okay?
Better.
No. Okay.
Mike, we have another mic.
It's not the mic, it's the wires.
Is this on?
Second mic.
Can you hear now okay?
You know what, you might bring it up next.
I think this is
Try the other one.
Hello? Hello?
Good one. See what?
Yes, it does. Okay. Well, first of all, let me say it's a great pleasure and, in fact, very much an honor to be here. Linda Gordon is both my colleague, and she is certainly one of the most distinguished historians in our country for many of the reasons that have been laid out when she was first introduced at this event. She's written in many, many different genres. She's embraced many, many different subjects. It's really quite staggering. Her scholarship has been recognized again and again and again at the very highest levels. But a through line, in many respects, through lines are social and political movements. I mean, they course through many of her works. So it makes a lot of sense that she would try to put this book together in a very, very ambitious way. She makes clear in the book that she's not doing this to kind of lay out a way forward, but in fact to try to understand and gain some meaning out of the past, to help us interrogate how social movements are put together. She's focused today on the chapter in the book that deals with the 1920s Ku Klux Klan and its fascist successors. That's only one chapter in the book. I wanted to say a couple of things about the rest of the book. There are 6 other chapters. Some of them deal with social and political movements that are familiar to us, such as the Settlement House movement, the Montgomery bus boycott, consciousness raising as activism. But one of the things that's really remarkable about the book is you can start with movements you think you understood, and it's a much fresher perspective and one chiefly from the ground up. And so I found myself really taking in a great deal, but she also looks at social movements that are not as well known, but that were very consequential in ways we should understand. The movement of the unemployed in the 1930s, the movement of farm workers in the 1960s and 1970s. I want to ask her a little bit about another movement that actually is in a chapter that follows the chapter on the Klan, and that's the chapter on the Townsend movement of the 1930s. This is not very well known. It was organized by a doctor in California named Francis Townsend, and it was a movement for old age pensions. And one of the, I mean, there's many things that are really fascinating about this, including Townsend's own sort of complex political arc, which begins as a socialist, as many of his followers were for a time. One of the things that's very interesting that Linda Gordon points out is that the social base of the Townsend movement and the social base of the Klan were almost identical. You're talking about Protestants, you're talking about middle-class business types. And I guess my question to start off is to think a little bit about what to make out of that. Because we're looking at a time period of roughly 2 decades. The Klan had been the largest social movement really of the 1920s. And as Linda Gordon points out, the Townsend movement is the largest social movement of the 1930s. They both seem to feed off similar social groups, and yet their politics are much more complicated. So I'm wondering, is this a story about the volatility of politics? Is this a story about, in some ways, the dangers of politics that seem progressive in some respects, but are potentially hedged in?
Thanks. Have I got this on? You can hear me? First of all, I just want to say one thing about a bit of background that's very important to understand the impact of the Townsend movement. When the Social Security Act was being drafted, it originally did not include old age pensions. Old age pensions were the most controversial part of it because the argument was if we support these old people with tax money, then their children are not going to be responsible for that. It took a real pressure from the movement to change that. The Townsend, of course, as far as I know, the Townsend movement was the first, the only movement that I've ever heard of that was a movement of old people. That didn't mean that it didn't have a lot of younger supporters because in demanding, as they did, government old age pensions, younger people could see that they stood to gain as they got older. The notion of pointing out the similarity with the Klan is really interesting because there were elements of Townsend's ideology that were quite conservative. They were religious. The Townsend movement was almost 100% white. It did, however, I want to just pick up two major differences. One is the majority of Townsend members were probably women, and the women in the Townsend movement was built around local clubs in which women operated clubs, and in these clubs they listened to lectures about the economy and old age pensions, but they also had raffles, they had played games, in other words, these clubs became recreational. And that had nothing to do with the original conception of the part of Townsend. It's very much something that happens when you get a bunch of old people together, and it would happen to any people. But ironically, for many of these people, well, I actually had a graduate student that wrote a dissertation about one particular Wisconsin local, so I got a little bit of a ground up. A lot of people in the Townsend movement didn't really register what the goal was. It was something to do. It was recreational, and it brought people together. This is something that was probably true of the Klan, but I would just say one thing that made it very different, and that is these Klan meetings had these occult rituals. They were not meetings in which there was ever free discussion about anything. Now, there is a pleasure in that enacting rituals. It's like play acting, it's like drama. And it was very high drama, especially with the costumes. But they do have something in common about what can make a social movement really big.
Well, excuse me, to follow that a little bit, there's a number of really important concepts that Linda tries to develop in the book as a way of exploring the whole phenomenon of social movements. And one is spaces. And I wondered if you could, it seems to me that part of what you're talking about in terms of the Townsend movement and the Klan as well, because obviously Klan recreational activities were very, very important as a way of creating what you also talk about as solidarities or connection, senses of belonging. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about spaces as an important aspect of movement building.
Really good question. I want to start actually, because I think it illustrates the importance of space, by talking about the Montgomery bus boycott and where those people could meet. They did not have access to public theaters, to public auditoriums. They met in churches. That was the only thing that people had. And this says something about how important it is to have spaces. Now, Townsend could meet anywhere. People, they were just a bunch of crazy old codgers. They didn't represent anything dangerous. So that was easy for them, although they did sometimes have to pay, and they did pay dues, and they did, profiteer in some way. They get people to buy their newspapers. But I want to talk about a place where a situation in which having a space was much more difficult, and that was in building the Farmworkers Union. They had no access to large spaces. They did occasionally be able to meet in a church or so on. And that fact says something really important about Cesar Chavez's method of organizing, which was very much kind of one-on-one. He would meet someone, he would start to talk to them about this and say, could you invite a few friends to come over to your house, and I will come and talk about this. It was very, very low level, and of course small, because at the first, Chavez was very, very canny about this. Had they shown to the big growers what was going on, there would have been more repression earlier. There was plenty of repression, but luckily that didn't really come about until they had built a very large movement. This method of organizing, unlike the Townsend, or unlike the Klan, had the effect of creating a sort of other level of leadership, because Chavez couldn't possibly go to each one of these areas. And if you look carefully at what was going on in and I do not want to, let me just say, Cesar Chavez was really an organizing genius. He was an amazing person. But he couldn't have done it, right? He had this sort of second level cadre, and they started doing it, and you get this movement downward of more and more people taking initiatives. And that smallness, I think, and the fact that it was constructed in part because of lack of access to public space, then became one of the strengths of the movement, because it was not just a union. It was, in fact, is the birth of what people today call social movement unionism, in which what a union does is not just conduct strikes and negotiate contracts, but builds a movement among people.
That gets us to another related issue. The chapter on the farm workers, as well as the chapter on the Montgomery bus boycott, are titled Leadership and Followership. One of the conceptual innovations that Linder is offering up is this idea of followership as an important aspect of social movement building and of the dynamic of the movements themselves. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about what brought you to this idea of followership and how you see it playing out.
Yeah, this had a lot to do with my interest in looking at the ground level, what people were doing. I'm a little uncomfortable about the term because follow somehow implies that you're always just following someone else. But let me illustrate what I mean by a few words about the Montgomery bus boycott. It was started by lay people, but it really took off when a few of those people and Martin Luther King got the rest of the black ministers behind it. And that was essential because they could be in churches. But it was also very much of a community building thing. But, and I'm sure some of these people were followers, but consider what this meant. First of all, for working people in Montgomery, Alabama, this boycott of the public transportation, which is what they were doing, went on for 13 months. That meant that a lot of people had to find a way to get to their jobs. There were literally thousands of maids, of black maids, who needed to be able to get to work. It was ragged at first, but after a while, what they did is they organized carpools. They pooled money. They bought at first, I think, 12 vans. They set up a system of transportation that was like a subway system. There were certain posts where you could transfer from one to the other, since not every van could go to every place. Doing all this really asks a tremendous amount of people. So to call them just followers, of course they were followers, and they were, and I'm sure many of us would have been too, they were awed when they first heard Martin Luther King. From the very beginning, he had a way of speaking that just started people. But there was no way. Martin Luther King was an energizer of the movement. He started to travel to raise money. He was not an organizer. He didn't do this work. You had to have a whole lot of people, and a whole lot, you have to understand, we're talking about African American people. There were maybe 3 whites in Montgomery who would support the bus boycott, and there was a lot of violence directed at them. But just one other notion about the so-called followership. At one point, some of the more conservative ministers met secretly with the city leadership of Montgomery and offered a compromise settlement. When people heard about that, there was an unbelievable explosion of rage against these guys. They were seen as traitors. They were not our ministers. And it took Martin Luther King to negotiate, not to negotiate with him, but to keep that anger under control. And so, one of the simple lessons is in a social movement, if people are required to do something, and they're doing it all the time, it is very, very strengthening to a social movement. It's much harder to deal with a social movement when you're just having talk in meetings.
Yeah, we're going to switch gears a little bit and open things up. And as you're preparing your questions, let me just ask you a quick one. Imagine you're a future historian.
Maybe I'll stand.
Sure, but bring the mic with you.
So I can see people.
Imagine you're a future historian,
Yeah.
and you've been asked to explain the rise of Trumpism in the extreme right in the United States. Is there a social movement that's driving this transformation? And if so, what are distinctive features?
Well, I'm no expert, and I'm sure there are people in this room who know more than I do, or at least as much as I do. But the Trump phenomenon is a bit, gains from being a bit like a social movement. It is energizing people. It is energizing in ways that I think most of us would find abhorrent. I don't mean to imply that it was any kind of a democracy, but I do think that Trump apparently had a particular quality that you sometimes see in social movement leaders, which is he could make people feel that he was talking directly to them, personally, that he understood things that they were going through. The difference, however, is that there is no there are no local clubs.
among the trumpeters.
So it's not the same, but it does have some social movement characteristics. And when you look at this, one of the things you see is how important emotion was in this movement. This is a movement that's filled with people making claims that are completely absurd, and probably most of their people who follow them know they're absurd, but there is this way that well, it's hard for me to say it,
Yes.
because I find Trump so despicable that he seems to reach people.
But you're locating the kind of agency here more in the charismatic leader and his capacity to earn followers than you are in the kind of grassroots, bottom-up set of organizations. That's what I'm hearing.
What about the Tea Party?
The Tea Party is being mentioned. You know, I've not really given a lot of thought to this, but you know, there are leaders and leaders, right? And there are leaders who are really good organizers, are really principled, careful people who may not have that ability to reach out and connect, to make people feel that he is talking to you personally. He knows what is happening. I think you see that more in the farm worker movement, because we're talking about people who all shared the same situation. But I'm not sure I can really...
Fair enough. Linda, I think we've lost these things. That means we're not going to be shouted at anymore by noise. So we're just going to talk loudly. I'm going to open up the floor. Could you raise your hand if we have a lot of questions? It might take a few at a time. Renee, why don't you start?
Sure. Thank you so much for this talk and for the commentary. Really, really excited about this book. I'd love to hear just how you define what is a social movement, right? It's such slippery language. And then I would love to hear how you chose these 7, right? There's a whole lot of others. Why are these the 7 that are featured in this book?
Great question.
That's a great question. Did people in the back hear that?
Yep.
Yes. Okay. Well, first of all, there is a vast literature, mainly in sociology, trying to define what is a social movement. I'm not sure I can do that, and I also, like many historians, I think that, you know, the devil's in the details, that seeing how things really work is important. One thing about social movements is that they involve activism outside of the normal electoral system. That doesn't mean they don't use the electoral system when they can, but they are building connections between the people, and they are creating optimism. You can't do a social movement very well if people don't have some hope that things can change. And that's not easy. In the story of the farm workers, it's not as if farm workers' struggles began in the 1960s. Starting in the 20s, the 30s, we are talking about possibly not only the poorest labor force in the United States, a labor force that is also being poisoned by the enormous amount of pesticides that were being used on these crops, and a labor force that was not white. It was mainly, there were Filipinos, there were a few others, but it was mainly Mexicans of 3 categories, and the categories are important because they were all, there were Mexican Americans, there were Mexicans who had some equivalent of status to be able to be in the States, and then there were Mexicans who came from Mexico and had to go back to Mexico when there was no work out there. So, I'm not sure I'm getting at your question, but I find myself really hesitating to make a generalization that is something other than so abstract and so above earthing that it's not really useful to us.
I'm glad you're able to have a career as a historian. It worked out. You want to say something about why these 7?
Oh yeah, I forgot that. Well, one of the things is I wanted to look at movements of the 20th century. I wanted them to be a little diverse. One of them had to be something that was not something we would admire. But I also, like many historians, I had to rely on where I could find sources. That was most difficult about the Townsend movement. They had a big headquarters, they had all the financial dealings, but these local clubs did not keep minutes, they were not having meetings, so this was very, very difficult. I can tell you how I got there. Then the hardest thing for me was writing about not just the women's liberation movement, but particularly the socialist feminist part of the women's liberation movement, in which I was a participant, and that's what makes it difficult. Because it was probably one of the happiest times in my life, certainly one of the most optimistic times. It was a movement that absolutely changed women's and men's lives. But it also gave me a possibility to look at the women's liberation movement is usually seen as overwhelmingly white, and it was overwhelmingly white. But in Boston, there was this small black women's organization called the Columbia River Collective. It was very small, but its manifesto, or whatever you want to call it, has been published literally over and over again throughout the world. It has been translated into Finnish. It has been translated into Russian. So you have something really different here, because there you have a group of women who are clearly leaders, who are mobilizing other people. The much larger dominantly white organization, which was called Bread and Roses, did not have that. In fact, it had an allergy to official leadership. Classic New Left thing. This is going to be completely democratic, and as a result, it was completely decentralized. It was less an organization, and it was a nexus of a lot of different projects, some of which I'm sure you're aware of. This is where that whole series of books, starting with Our Bodies Ourselves, this is where the organization 9 to 5 came from. And some of you may have, if you haven't seen the film of 9 to 5, it's very, very cool. Anyway, so that was another issue that I found very interesting, was not only the difference in quantity, but also the different approach to how things were made.
Let's open it up. Some more questions, please.
Were there any successful, like, direct counter movements against, like, talking about the Klan?
Well, first of all, it depends on what you call a movement. The city of Montgomery not only did everything to stop this, but in the process, the Ku Klux Klan in Montgomery enlarged by 150,000%. It had been actually very, people probably believed in it, but it was in disarray. It wasn't doing much. And so you have that movement that's giving rise to a very important one, to a very opposite one of difference. I think that certainly when you're talking about women's liberation, there was a different movement. There were particularly women, some of them are very famous, who were really attacking this and saying that these people are going to destroy the family, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the problems with that is that it's a little bit harder to construct a movement opposed to a social movement that is also a social movement, has the social movement advantages itself. And so a lot of this opposition comes from the top down, and it can be very effective because there's a lot of money. There's a lot of important spokespeople that you can get to do this. I also just should say, no, I don't know.
We'll do more questions.
The discussion of leadership and fellowship reminded me of this kind of classic gender division of labor that we often see in social movements. Men doing certain types of work, women doing other types of work. How do you see that playing out in the different groups that you look at?
Linda, hold on. Hold on to that question. And we're going to take another one from the back row. Go ahead. You had your hand up there. Yeah. Yes.
Oh, thanks. Dr. Gordon, it's such a pleasure to be here.
It's hard to hear you, sorry.
Sure. It's such a pleasure to be here. I've just loved all your work, moral property of women, and everything on reproductive rights going way back. I'm a former punk rocker and third waver who myself had to historicize the third wave women's movement for an encyclopedia, so I know how hard it is. We're a quarter into the 21st century. We're a quarter into the 21st century. Do you have your eyes on anything that you think will be important for the 21st?
Yeah, two questions.
I'd like to address followership, and because one of these movements has a very sad ending. Cesar Chavez started out building this movement on this very nitty-gritty level, but as they developed, as they were negotiating contracts, several things happened. First, they had to have a whole staff of lawyers. You can't negotiate a contract with a big grower with people who don't know the law. And that put a lot of pressure on the movement because a lot of lawyers just didn't want to work for the wages that farm workers got. So there was a lot of tension around it. Then what you have is that Cesar Chavez was like a saint. And he built that reputation deliberately. He went at least twice. He did these fasts that were actually life-threatening. And the fact that you have people who are very Catholic, and you use the Catholic imagery, they use the Catholic imagery all the time. It was a symbol of the movement was the Virgin of Guadalupe. That puts people, helps people get in a position of passivity in relation to him. And there's a lot more I could say, but one of the things that happened at the end is that Chavez really became unhinged, and his followership did not contain people who were willing to challenge him. And this is a key problem in leadership that you can see in a lot of places.
Yeah, 21st century, and do you see any exciting social movements? Or what do you see emerging in the 21st century?
Well, certainly I think as many of you see, there's growing opposition to the Trump administration. It's not, I don't know that it has reached the level of a social movement. It's very scattered. And you have now this, in other words, I would say that the Trump followers are more like a social movement than the opposition. And that is a real problem for how to operate. There has been a lot of evidence of resentment of the way even liberals and well-meaning people can speak about people who are not so much poor, but who are not well educated, who are business people, who have different sets of values, and that is very, very difficult. It's not a good thing. But on the other hand, how do you stop people from doing that? There is no organizational discipline. When you had the Montgomery Bus Stop, when you had the United Farm Workers Union, there was discipline. There were certain things that you had to do, certain things that you, and people accepted because they saw that discipline was productive. But it's not clear to me how a social movement in that very, very displaced way can have much political power.
Steve, do you want to?
Yeah, I guess it follows on that, and I just wanted to raise this question, which I think the book and so much of what you've said kind of hovers over us, which is the chapter on the Klan and the fascists who followed. remind us that in American history, for the most part, the largest social movements and the ones that have been able to claim power at various levels have been movements of the right. I think the only exception to that would be the anti-slavery movement. So my question is, what do we, looking in the 21st century, what do we make out of that? Why has the right been so successful? The right has, sort of been in the process of building a movement for a long time. And they've succeeded. So most of the story we tell is about social movements that are quote-unquote progressive, of the left of various sorts, that have an influence on policy, but in terms of claiming power, and in terms of really building a scale, they really are pretty much overwhelmed by movements of the right. So
Yeah, I think
I wish I could ask a better question to finish this up.
if I think of something that is a slight exception, it would be the union organizing drive of the Depression. Now, this did not become a universal movement, but those were extraordinarily successful. They absolutely revolutionized the economic status of working class people in those places. They revolutionized them in the sense of having more control. You couldn't be fired at will just because you said something bad about the boss. Now that's a certain population, but it also has to do with this other thing that I think about a lot, which is that if you want to build a social movement, you have to give people something to do. You cannot just expect them to discuss and have abstract conclusions about what's valuable.
I mean, it's interesting. You can see American history as having this kind of battle between a more inclusive vision, an ever more democratic vision, and a more nativist and exclusive vision of the country. And you see those forces playing themselves out. Steve, I'm not a historian, and I'm going to defer to you on this, but you could also tell a story in which a nation that's born in slavery, genocide establishes over time, more inclusive democracy, welfare state, public schools, public universities, women's suffrage and women's rights, far more immigration. So it's not clear to me that the story of social movements is necessarily the story of the right conquering more inclusive vision, but clearly the scale has tipped to one side. And I don't know that anyone in this room has a vision for how we get to the other side. And I guess the sociologist question is whether there are conditions that make it more likely that we'll go one way than the other.
Yeah,
All of us to figure that out.
I think one of the things that I would underline at the moment when you're thinking is that it sounds corny, but in social movements, people have to have a deep emotional investment in the cause, in the people they work together with. And, I don't want to reduce left politics to questions of emotion, but I do have to say that I would have some suspicion that the lack of comfort with that has helps explain why intellectuals aren't very good at doing social movements, because they are very, very committed to analyze. I can take that in a place that I don't agree with. I don't want to go too far with that.
I'm sure a lot of us in the room can identify with that. Let me say, I think we're at a moment where the overriding emotional vector of the country is fear and anxiety, and that's a certain thing that cultivate personal style of governance. And I think one of our goals here at IDK is to make sure that we don't get sunk into that, and that there's another way that we can work together collectively, collaboratively. Steve, I see you want to say something. I just want to say to all of you that one of our real missions here is to provide a gathering place where we can come together and process ideas about things that happened in the past, about what's happening now, about where we're going to go in the future. Before you jump in there, I want to say two things we haven't. For those of you who are really interested in the topic of tonight's conversation, on Thursday night, also at 5:30, we have a terrific panel on comparative authoritarianism across the world. And on Monday, May 5th, we have a terrific conversation between Fred Turner from Stanford you on authoritarianism in media. We've been doing a lot of programming on this kind of issue, so if you're interested in this conversation, please return. I'm going to give the two of you the last word. Steve, why don't you go first?
Well, I was just going to say that, one of the things we have to recognize, and I've spent a lot of time thinking and writing about this, is the very deep history of what you could call illiberalism, which is a sort of broad concept which fascism is a form that has run close to the surface in American history and society for a very, very long time. And it erupts at certain points. It has many of the characteristics that Linda associated with fascism. So I think we need to understand that in terms of what we're up against. But the second thing that I think is really important about Linda's book is that what she alerts us to are the many, many political threads that we oftentimes overlook, that we don't take seriously enough, that are equally part of our past, and that we need to excavate and we need to understand, many of which fail, but nonetheless they leave us, sort of a great deal to sort of understand and to sort of integrate to the way in which we think about, sort of our own world. And one of the things I really appreciated about Linda's book is a reminder that the world doesn't focus around only a couple of threads as if liberalism is everything or illiberalism is the only other thing that's out there. Many other political ideas, political movements, political organizations have been part of our past. And we need to remember that, and we need to learn more about them. And you help us.
Sure, the last word is yours. Anything you want to leave us with?
I like social movements. And I do think that one of the things that we saw in many of these is that people who participate in social movements, especially if they're instructive, have a good time. It's enjoyable. People like working together in that way with other people. But again, I would just emphasize having something to do. What I said about Bread and Roses is all these different projects, and every single person had to be doing things, not just going to a meeting and listening and talking.
Great. Well, I'm going to encourage all of you to